After my husband passed away, I hired someone to repair the wooden floor in his study. I was standing in the kitchen pouring coffee when my phone started vibrating. The worker's voice sounded tense and urgent. "Ma'am, could you come here right now? There's something under the floor." When I walked in, I was shocked by what I saw in front of me, a secret. One that no one in my family was ever supposed to know. Hello everyone, welcome to our story. Before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. A quick note, this is a fictional story and some details were created to make the storytelling more engaging and meaningful. Any similarities to real names or places are purely coincidental. The scream of the circular saw against the old oak planks was the first thing to break the silence of my husband's study in 2 years. Beth Garrison, a 64-year-old retired librarian, stood in the doorway of the office I hadn't touched since James's funeral, clutching a cold cup of coffee. The room was exactly as he had left it, draped in the heavy scent of old wax and the stagnant air of a life interrupted. Dust motes danced in the morning sun, swirling like tiny ghosts around the mountain of mahogany furniture. I watched Thane Garrison, a 42-year-old floor specialist with sawdust in his beard and calloused hands as he knelt on the original oak planks of the study. He was my husband's nephew, a man who worked with a quiet, reverent precision that I appreciated in my current state of fragile grief. He was meticulously stripping the finish when the metallic bite of his crowbar met a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the solid thud of timber against joist, but a hollow, resonant echo. Thane stopped. He tapped the wood again, his brow furrowed. "Miss Garrison, you might want to see this," he said, his voice low. "The wood here. It's not sitting on the joists like the rest of the room." I stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under my slippers. "I thought James had just reinforced the floor for the safe," I murmured, remembering how my husband had fussed over the weight of his documents. But as Thane moved the heavy desk aside, the truth began to splinter. He pointed to a section of the floor that looked seamless to the naked eye, but yielded to the slight pressure of his boot. How many times had I vacuumed over this very spot, never knowing a ghost was whispering beneath my feet? The realization that my husband had built a secret into the very foundation of our home sent a chill through me that the morning sun couldn't reach. James was a man of patterns and predictable habits, or so I had spent 40 years believing. Thane didn't wait for my permission. He sensed the urgency in my silence. He positioned his tool with surgical care. The wood didn't just snap, it surrendered. With a sharp crack, 3 short planks popped free, revealing a custom-built lined cavity nestled beneath the subfloor. Inside, shielded from the humidity and the passage of time, lay a vintage leather briefcase. My breath hitched in my throat as I recognized the weathered tan hide and the tarnished brass buckles. "It's his old travel case," I whispered, reaching out to touch the cold leather. He said he lost it in the airport 3 years ago. I remembered the week he had spent grumbling about the airline's incompetence and the loss of his favorite fountain pens. Thane looked at me, his expression unreadable. "He didn't lose it, Beth. He hid it." The weight of that deception felt like a physical blow. I took the case from the floor, my fingers trembling as I stared at the 4-digit combination lock. I tried our anniversary first, then the year of James's birth, but the tumblers refused to yield. My mind raced through the numbers that defined our life together, searching for the one he would trust to guard a secret. Finally, I tried my daughter Ilara's birthday, 1115. The latch gave a heavy metallic clack, and as I lifted the lid, I realized James hadn't hidden money. He had hidden a confession. My fingers brushed the cool aged leather of the briefcase, a physical anchor to a husband who had been dead for 2 years, but was suddenly screaming to be heard. I didn't want to touch the papers inside, but the first thing I saw was a heavy vellum envelope with my name written across it in James's distinctive architectural script. I realized then that James didn't hide this case because of some vague general secret. He had entombed it beneath the floorboards because he knew Ilara was coming for him, and he hadn't trusted me to see the truth while he was still alive. He had protected me from the horror of our own daughter until his protection became a silent subterranean lie. I clutched the case to my chest and walked toward the kitchen, my slippers whispering against the hardwood. "Beth, are you okay in there?" Thane called out from the study, his voice muffled by the distance. I paused by the refrigerator, the hum of the appliance sounding like a low-grade alarm. "I am fine, Thane. Just give me a minute," I replied, though my voice felt thin and brittle. I sat at the kitchen table, the ticking of the wall clock counting down the seconds of my old life. When I tore the envelope open, the faint lingering scent of his old cologne, sandalwood, and cedar wafted out, momentarily paralyzing me with a grief so sharp it felt like a fresh wound. I forced my eyes to the page. The letter was dated September 8th, 2023, just weeks before his heart supposedly failed him. My husband began by detailing a systematic theft of $200,000 from our primary retirement account over the course of 14 months. He described his initial confusion as he watched the balances dip, a confusion that slowly crystallized into a terrifying clarity. The words on the page weren't just ink. They were lead weights sinking into the pit of my stomach, dragging my reality into the dark. He had tracked the transfers, tracing them back to Alara with the meticulous precision he applied to every blueprint he ever drew. "I didn't want to believe it, Beth," he wrote. "I fought the evidence until it nearly broke me. I reached for my coffee, but the taste was bitter and cold. My hand shook as I turned to the second page. James described feeling unnaturally weak, a heavy lethargy that settled into his bones every time Alara brought him his heart supplements. He wrote of how helpful she had always been with the refills, her smiles masking the gradual thinning of his pulse. How does a mother reconcile the child she cradled with the woman who would watch her father's heart fail for a few digital entries in a bank ledger? I felt a sickening pull in my gut, a physical rejection of the image of my daughter standing over him with a glass of water and a handful of poison. James revealed that he had finally confronted Alara 3 days before he died. Her response hadn't been a tearful denial or a plea for forgiveness. Instead, she had looked him in the eye and suggested that I wouldn't handle the scandal well if he involved the authorities. She had used my own fragility as a weapon to keep him silent. The letter continued, and my breath caught as I read his final instructions. "Beth, if you're reading this and I'm already gone, know that I made choices in my final days that may seem reckless. I'm meeting with David Cunningham tomorrow, and depending on what he advises, I may have to take drastic steps to draw them out into the open. If I disappear, or if something happens to me, don't think I abandoned you. Everything I do now, I do to keep you safe. I would confess to crimes I didn't commit if it meant they'd leave you alone." The last line of the letter wasn't a goodbye. It was a map to a notebook that James promised held the final, undeniable proof of a murder attempt, and a warning that if I was reading this, the danger hadn't passed, it had only transferred to me. I didn't let myself cry. I couldn't. Instead, I reached back into the briefcase for the brown cardboard notebook James had promised would hold the truth. The smell of old paper usually calmed me, but today every page felt like a cold slab of evidence. My fingers practiced in the delicate art of turning fragile manuscripts from my years as a librarian felt clumsy as I spread the papers across the desk, the blue glow of my lamp reflecting off my glasses. As I began to categorize the transfers, a disturbing reality emerged. The $200,000 theft wasn't a single desperate grab. It was a series of automated drip transfers, a financial parasite that drew blood only when James was at his weakest. I realized the software had been rigged to trigger withdrawals whenever his smartwatch heart rate monitor hit specific elevated thresholds. Every time his heart raced in panic or struggled in sleep, someone profited. I whispered to the empty room, "You weren't just dying, James. You were being harvested." Numbers don't lie, but people certainly do, and these numbers were screaming. The largest withdrawals perfectly synced with his most aggressive hospitalizations. Every heart episode was preceded by a massive transfer to an offshore shell company. Red ink everywhere. It wasn't blood, but it felt like it. I moved to cross-reference the medical bills with these entries, the silence of the house pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I found a hidden pocket in the ledgers, binding my nail catching on a small slip of onion skin paper. It It was a receipt for a private courier. The delivery dates matched the exact dates James's vitals had plummeted. The courier had been delivering supplements from an unlisted pharmacy. I stared at the receipt until the blue ink blurred. "Wait," I muttered. "This isn't a medical bill, it's a bribe." I turned to the final page of the notebook, my tongue tasting the bitter dregs of my cold coffee. There at the bottom of the last column was a recurring monthly retainer, $5,000 paid on the first of every month for 14 months. The name E. Vane stared back at me. Elena Vane, my little sister, 2 years younger, now 62 years old. Elena, the girl I'd taught to ride a bike, the girl who crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, clutching her stuffed rabbit, whispering, "Don't let the monsters get me, Beth." I hadn't spoken to her in a decade, not since our parents died in that house fire in Newton 10 years ago. The fire marshal ruled it faulty wiring, but the insurance investigator found accelerant traces near the gas line. 3 weeks before the fire, our mother had rewritten her will, cutting Elena out entirely after discovering she'd stolen $40,000 from our father's business account to cover gambling debts. Our parents, both of them burned to death in their bedroom. The estate came to me. Elena disappeared after the funeral, resurfacing months later to accuse me of being the golden child. But the payments didn't make sense. James despised Elena. Why would he pay her $70,000 over 14 months? I flipped back through the pages and found a paper-clipped section, a printout of email correspondence between Alara and someone with the initial E. The subject line read, "Final offer." Alara's message was cold. "Forget the monthly payments when Beth is gone and the estate is liquidated. You get $300,000 cash wire transfer, untraceable. That's 60 months of your current arrangement in one lump sum. Are you in or out?" Elena's response came within an hour. "I'm in. Send me the digitalis dosage protocol. The golden child has had her turn." My hands went numb. Elena hadn't just been extorting James, she'd sold me out for a lump sum. My little sister was the architect of my husband's murder, and now she was coming for me too. I sat in the heavy silence of the study, staring at the name E. Vane on the ledger page, trying to reconcile my sister with a killer. My sister's name was written in the same ink as the man who killed my husband, and the shock felt like a slow-acting poison in my own veins. To move from the physical evidence to the digital, I reached for James's laptop. The laptop screen hissed to life, a rectangular sun bleaching the grief right off my face and illuminating the blue light reflecting on my knuckles. I bypassed the simple password "our wedding anniversary," feeling a surge of guilt that quickly turned to bile. "You always were too predictable with numbers," James, I whispered to the empty room. I immediately searched the inbox for Elena's name but found nothing. Instead, I discovered a hidden partition labeled with a cipher James had used for rare book acquisitions. As the files decrypted, I realized the recurring payments to my sister weren't for services rendered in a murder plot. They were blackmail payouts James had been making for years to keep Elena away from me. He had been buying her silence to protect me from the toxicity of our past, never realizing that his secrecy was providing the very shadow Alara needed to hide her own work. The dry heat of the study felt oppressive as I dug deeper into the digital sarcophagus. Click, delete. If only it were that easy to erase a murder. I watched the cursor blink a steady heartbeat in a room filled with death. My focus became Manic, the librarian in me, transforming into a digital hunter. I soon found a threaded conversation between two accounts, E. Thorne and E. Blackwood. It didn't take long to realize these were aliases for my daughter, Ilari, and Everett, the family lawyer. The emails were clinical, devoid of any daughterly affection or professional ethics. They discussed dosage titration and simulated cardiac arrest symptoms with the cold detachment of a laboratory report. My God, they were talking about him like he was furniture. I gasped. The prosecution attorney, Amanda Collins, described how Everett wasn't just the legal counsel managing the shell companies. He was the source of the pharmaceutical-grade digitalis. His family owned the very labs that produced the concentrated toxins used to stop my husband's heart. He was providing the weapon, and Alara was the one pulling the trigger, one supplement at a time. The nauseating betrayal settled in my stomach like lead as I realized my presence at the hospital had been used as a cover. a way to make the slow decline look like natural failure to the outside world. Attached to the final email was a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me sleeping in the hospital chair beside James's bed, my face lined with exhaustion. The caption beneath it, written by Everett to my daughter, simply read, "The obstacle is neutralized." I snapped the laptop lid shut, the sharp plastic crack echoing like a gunshot in the midnight stillness of the study. The room was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage where I had been watched and categorized as an obstacle. Every shadow in the corner seemed to lengthen, reaching out to remind me that the surveillance photo Everett had sent to my daughter was taken when I was at my most vulnerable. I stood up, my knees trembling, and looked around at James's collection of tobacco pipes and architectural awards. I knew I had to find the physical evidence mentioned in those clinical emails. My hands moved with a frantic energy I hadn't felt in years as I tore the velvet lining from the bottom of James's humidor, my nails catching on the wood as I hunted for the physical ghost of his murder. The smell of cedar and stale tobacco wafted up a scent that used to mean home, but now felt like the musk of a tomb. Beneath the false bottom, I didn't just find a hidden compartment. I found a small, unmarked prescription bottle. Inside were clear capsules that looked as innocent as vitamins, but I knew better now. These were the digitalis doses that had slowly tightened the noose around James's heart. However, as I poured a few into my palm, I noticed a tiny handwritten note tucked into the cap in James's minute script placebos. It hit me then that James hadn't been a passive victim toward the end. He had intercepted the poison, replaced the capsules, and kept the real ones as evidence, meaning he knew exactly who was handing him his death in a glass of water. Beside the bottle was a small digital recorder, its black casing cold against my sweaty palm. Do you know what it sounds like when your world stops turning? It sounds like the click of a play button. I sank back into the leather chair, the air in the room turning to ice as I prepared to hear the dead speak. I pressed the button with a shaking finger, my heart hammering against my ribs. At first, there was only the rhythmic hiss-click of a hospital ventilator and the wet, labored breathing of a man fighting for air. Then the tinny, distorted quality of the recording was pierced by a voice I had heard every day of my life. Alara spoke with a cold, clinical detachment that stripped away every memory I had of her childhood smiles. "It's a beautiful way to go, James," she said, her voice sounding bored as she explained how the digitalis would mask itself within his existing heart medication. Systematic and quiet. Silence. Then the monster spoke again, dismissing my presence with a casual cruelty that felt like a knife in my chest. "Don't worry about Beth. She sees what I want her to see." I felt a cold sweat dripping down my spine as I listened to her mock my gullibility, realizing that my own love had been used as a tool for his execution. But then, her tone shifted, becoming urgent as she mentioned a third party who was impatient. She said the house needed to be cleared immediately for an excavation that James had refused to allow. She wasn't just killing him for the inheritance, she was clearing the land for something buried beneath us. As Alara's recorded voice laughed, a real floorboard creaked in the hallway right behind my chair. I didn't breathe, my hand white-knuckled around the heavy brass paperweight as I stared at the door's reflection in the darkened laptop screen. My heart hammered against my ribs with such violence, I was certain it would alert whoever was standing in the shadows of the hallway. I waited for the door to burst open, for the end to arrive in a rush of cold air and violence. But the footsteps remained rhythmic, a steady mechanical thud-thud that didn't vary in pace or weight. Suddenly, the sound simply stopped, vanishing as if the floorboards had swallowed the intruder whole. I realized then that the sound hadn't come from the hall at all. It was a recording, a pre-programmed security deterrent James had set to play at exactly 4 a.m. to scare off anyone snooping in his office after hours. Just a recording. I whispered, my voice trembling as I slumped back into the chair. "You were protecting me even when you couldn't stand up, weren't you?" My husband's paranoia was no longer a quirk to be humored. It was a lifeline. As the recording finished, a new icon flickered onto the desktop, a file labeled Final Message. It required a password, one I knew instantly the date we first met. I typed it in the grit of dust on the keyboard, feeling like sandpaper against my skin. James appeared on the screen, his face a map of pain and precision, looking directly into the camera as if he knew I'd be exactly here, exactly now. He looked gaunt, the blue glare of the monitor hollowing out his cheeks, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't waste time with platitudes. Everett isn't just a lawyer anymore, Beth. He said, his voice a raspy tether to a reality I wasn't ready to face. He's a dead man walking, and he's using my blood to buy his life. James explained that Everett had incurred a massive gambling debt to a man whose name made the air in the room feel thin. The name Vinnie Calabresi carried a weight of old-world violence that seemed to pulse from the screen. How do you mourn a man who is currently giving you instructions on how to take down his killers? It felt surreal listening to him narrate his own demise while providing a roadmap for my survival. James revealed that Everett and Alara were working together to liquidate the estate, but not just for the money. They were paying off the mob. He gave me specific coordinates for a physical safety deposit box key hidden inside the family mausoleum, tucked behind the Vane family crest. Go there, Beth. Don't trust the police, he warned, his image flickering as the computer fan vibrated the desk. The screen went black. The silence returned heavier than before. I sat in the ozone-scented air, the smell of old carpet and electronic heat thick in my lungs. James's final revelation chilled me more than the fake footsteps. He admitted that Calabresi was the third party demanding the excavation of our property. It wasn't for gold or land development. It was for something James had stolen from the mob decades ago, a secret he had buried literally and figuratively. He had thought time would dissolve the debt, but the debt had only grown teeth. James's final words weren't, "I love you," but a warning that sent me bolting upright. They're already in the garden, Beth. I turned toward the window, hearing the faint, distinct sound of distant crickets through the glass being cut short by a heavy, real footstep on the gravel below. I didn't stop to look at the shadows stretching across the lawn. I just threw the car into reverse and let the gravel scream under my tires. The warning from the screen was still ringing in my ears, and every rustle of the garden hedges felt like a hand reaching for my throat. I didn't breathe until the wrought iron gates of the estate were a mile behind me. I drove through the pre-dawn gray, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, until the blue and red neon of the precinct sign offered a flickering, desperate hope. The transition from the dark, haunted silence of my husband's study to the harsh, sterile hum of the police station made my head spin. I stumbled inside, clutching the leather briefcase to my chest like a shield. I demanded to see Detective Miller, my voice sounding like a stranger's, high and brittle. Detective Miller looked like a man who had seen too many sunsets through the grime of a precinct window, tired, sharp-eyed, and wearing a suit that had given up on its creases hours ago. He took me into an interview room that smelled of burnt precinct coffee and industrial cleaner. I dumped the ledger and the digital recorder onto the cold, smooth metal table, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush of digitalis, debt, and betrayal. Miller leaned back, his eyes moving from the evidence to the grit of lack of sleep behind my own eyes. "Slow down, Beth," he said. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to explain that the intruders James warned me about were real, but Miller stopped me with a heavy sigh. He revealed that those men weren't mobsters. They were private security hired by Everett to monitor the property. I had been watched the entire time I was in that study. The coffee was cold. The air was colder. My life was a crime scene. I sat under the harsh hum of overhead fluorescent lights, watching Miller scrub a hand over his face. He reviewed the digital files, but the professional skepticism remained etched in his brow. In this state, he began a recording as just noise without a toxicology report from the medical examiner. He explained the weight of the law to me, and it felt like being buried alive. Everett is a high-profile lawyer, Beth. He'll claim these recordings were fabricated or taken out of context. To secure an arrest for murder, we need physical remains. The law isn't a sword, it's a labyrinth, and Alara owns the map. He told me that without James's body, there was no case, but Alara, as the primary next of kin, legally controlled access to his remains. The crushing realization of the bureaucratic nightmare began to set in, but it got worse. Miller admitted that Alara had already been busy this morning. She had filed a restraining order against me, claiming I was mentally unstable and a danger to myself following the funeral. She was already painting me as the grieving, delusional widow to neutralize the truth. I felt my stomach drop as the trap tightened. Miller leaned in the distant, muffled sound of a police radio, the only thing breaking the silence between us. His voice dropped to a whisper, glancing toward the door. "If you want that body, Beth, you have to do it now. The cremation order Alara signed goes through at noon today." I checked my watch as I stepped out into the humid morning air, the ticking second hand, a tiny guillotine. I had less than 6 hours. Miller's warning echoed in the silence of the parking lot, a cold directive that stripped away my last shred of indecision. If I wanted James's body to tell its story, I had to stop that cremation before the noon sun hit its peak. I drove home with my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, realizing that my only hope lay in the very performance I had spent years avoiding. Grief is the perfect camouflage. No one looks too closely at a woman whose world has just turned to ash. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed several cardboard boxes piled in the corner of the porch, labeled trash, in Alara's sharp, aggressive script. My heart plummeted. She wasn't just planning an excavation. She'd already begun purging the house of James's existence. I entered the kitchen, the weight of a silver tray with trembling hands, as I prepared to play the role of the broken widow. Alara was already there, the smell of her expensive floral perfume masking the faint scent of floor wax. I forced my shoulders to slump, my eyes to downcast. "I am so sorry, Alara." I whispered, my voice thick with manufactured defeat. I haven't slept, and I wasn't thinking straight about the ledger or the office. I was just so lost. Alara turned her eyes, searching mine with a predatory intensity. "Of course, Mother," she said, her voice a silk trap. "We all process loss differently. Let's just focus on the final arrangements now." She stepped closer and offered a hug. "Have you ever hugged a murderer? It feels like holding a statue made of ice." I leaned into her, fighting the urge to recoil, knowing that every breath I took was being evaluated by the security Everett had placed around us. I felt like a bird in a glass cage watching the clock. Tick, tock. Noon was coming for us all. The tension was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Kate Donovan stood in the doorway, wrapped in her familiar cardigan and sensible flats. The same woman who had sat beside me in countless faculty meetings, who had held my hand at James's funeral. She was 63, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face lined with worry. "Beth," she said firmly, her voice cutting through Alara's fake concern. "I got your message. I came as fast as I could." Alara's eyes narrowed. "Mother, you didn't mention you'd invited company." "I didn't invite her," I replied, meeting Kate's steady gaze. "But she's staying. Kate has been my friend for 30 years. She was there when I married James, and she'll be here now." While Alara went to answer a call, Kate stepped toward me in the foyer, her familiar lavender perfume a comfort in the chaos. Her expression didn't waver, but her voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "Beth, I know something's wrong. You sounded terrified on the phone. What did you find in that office?" I stared at her, my breath catching. She was the only person outside this house I could trust completely. Kate squeezed my hand, her grip strong and steady, the same hands that had graded papers beside mine, that had brought me casseroles in the weeks after James died. "Whatever it is, you're not facing it alone," she whispered. "That's what friends are for." The simple declaration hit me like a lifeline thrown into dark water. I handed her the keys to the guest room and whispered, "Stay close, Kate. I need someone I can trust. I think James was murdered." The weight of the keys Kate had pressed into my palm felt like a live wire sparking against my skin. I had to move quickly, but with precision. I polished the silver until I could see my own reflection, a woman who looked like a widow but felt like a soldier. The metallic tang hung heavy in the air as I set the table for 4. The fine china gleamed under the chandelier. I placed Everett's setting at the head James's seat, now occupied by his murderer. Alara would sit to his right, and I across from her calculating eyes. But the 4th place I arranged with deliberate care at the far end. I set James's crystal water glass, his monogram napkin folded the way he preferred, and pulled out his chair at an angle, as if he'd just stepped away. When the front door groaned open, Everett stopped short, staring at the empty chair. "Beth, why is there?" "It's a family tradition," I interrupted softly. "We always set a place for those we've lost during important gatherings. James would have wanted to be here." I let my voice crack. Alara entered, saw the empty setting, and froze. "Of course, Mother," she said, voice like honey over glass. "That's very touching." Everett sat at the head, but his hand trembled, reaching for water. Alara smoothed her dress with shaking hands. "Good. Let them see ghosts." The dinner began with clinking crystal, but the atmosphere suffocated under James's vacant stare. I poured the blood-red Cabernet and listened as Everett outlined destroying James's legacy. He spoke of the mausoleum property with casual cruelty. Then he dropped his blow, leaning back in James's chair. He'd called the crematorium appointment moved to 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. My stomach dropped. I'd thought I had days, now less than 12 hours. But I forced a smile, nodding in grateful submission. I watched them eat the grandfather clock ticking away my life. The roast beef tasted like cardboard and lies. I barely swallowed, focused entirely on the wine bottle between us. Kate remained in the kitchen, waiting for my signal. "Excuse me," I said, voice trembling. "I think I left the dessert wine in the pantry." I retreated to the kitchen where James's emergency vial waited, a potent sedative, colorless and tasteless. I spiked the remaining Cabernet with clinical detachment. This wasn't murder, it was immobilization. I returned and refilled their glasses, watching as they drank deeply and toasted to James's peace. 10 minutes later, Everett's fork clattered. His head swayed. "Alara," he slurred, "I don't feel thump." His head hit the mahogany, one down. Alara's eyes widened, hand fluttering to her throat. "Mother, what did you—" Her speech dissolved into moans before she slumped forward. I stood over them, feeling cold triumph. The drugged wine's sweet aroma lingered as I steadied Everett's tilting torso. His skin felt clammy. As I moved to signal Kate, a burner phone in his pocket buzzed insistently. I pulled it out, the bright screen searing my eyes. A text from E. Vane, my sister, Elena. The words hit like a physical blow. "She knows. End it tonight." I stared at the screen. My sister wasn't just a beneficiary, she was the whistleblower on my every move. She'd been watching, waiting, and now giving the order for my execution. The temperature dropped. I looked at the unconscious forms, then at James's empty chair, meant as a symbol, but now feeling like a warning. The dead couldn't protect me. I'd have to protect myself. I knocked twice on the kitchen wall, the danger signal. Kate appeared, face pale. Her eyes took in the scene. 2 unconscious bodies, the incriminating phone, the empty chair bearing witness. "Beth, what happened?" "Everything," I replied hollowly. "Everything just happened." I pocketed the burner phone, its screen still glowing with my sister's treachery, like a radioactive coal. The blue light reflected on my pale skin as I stood in the heavy silence of the dining room, looking down at the slumped forms of Alara and Everett. Kate helped me drag them into the study, their bodies heavy and limp from the sedative. Once the door was locked, I showed her the screen. She sold us out, Kate, my own sister, as the architect of this. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing the breath from my lungs. But Kate didn't look surprised. She reached into her bag and pulled out several old files. Kate's voice was low and steady. She studied the documents I'd spread across the desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "Beth, this is bigger than you thought," she said quietly. "These payments to Elena I remember when your parents died in that fire 10 years ago in Newton. James came to me once years ago after he'd had too much wine at a faculty dinner. He told me he suspected Elena set that fire, that she killed both your parents for the inheritance after your mother cut her out of the will for stealing $40,000. He said the accelerant traces near the gas line were never proven, but he knew. I felt a sudden sharp chill in the study. He said he was paying her to stay away from you." Kate continued, her hand finding mine. "He called it buying your peace, $5,000 a month for 14 months to keep her from hurting you. He didn't want you carrying the burden of knowing your own little sister was a murderer who burned your mother and father alive." My world tilted. The sister I had mourned with was a monster James had been quietly protecting me from. My family tree was a gallows, every branch heavy with secrets and lies. We stood there, two women bound by the ghost of a man who had tried to build a fortress out of money to keep us safe. A soft thud at the servants' entrance made us both jump. Detective Miller slipped inside his coat, smelling of rain and wet asphalt, the small wireless earpiece in his left ear, blinking with a faint red light. He walked straight to the window overlooking the driveway, his face grim in the moonlight, then tapped the earpiece and spoke quietly. Unit 2, confirm visual on the black Escalade, stand by for my signal. He turned back to me and Kate. The audio surveillance I installed 3 days ago in this study, and your kitchen has been recording everything, Beth. Kate has a panic button in her pocket. If anything goes wrong, she presses it, and I'm here in under 2 minutes with backup. He gestured toward the window. Beyond the estate's perimeter lights, the muffled growl of an SUV's engine vibrated through the air. That's a professional at the wheel. Beth, this isn't a legal dispute anymore. He explained the plates belonged to an enforcer for Vinnie Calabrese, the loan shark Everett owed money to. They aren't waiting for Everett to wake up, they're waiting for the sun to go down. Miller checked his watch. The mob knew about the murder long before I did. They'd been perched there like vultures. The enforcer stepped out into the light, a towering silhouette with a distinctive jagged scar carved into his throat. He looked directly toward the study window and smiled. Miller pulled the curtains shut with a violent snap, his hand already resting on the grip of his sidearm. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with the weight of the man standing by the street lamp. I tried to keep my hand from shaking as I reached for the kettle, but the shadow of the man with the scar was still burned into my retinas. I needed to move to the kitchen to find some way to stall the inevitable approach of the men in that SUV. I left Kate and Miller in the study, my feet moving on autopilot across the hardwood floors. I expected to find the kitchen empty and silent, the house still under the spell of the sedative I'd served. Instead, the light was on. Alara stood by the stove, her back to me, her posture as rigid and perfect as a marble statue. She looked pale, but she was functional. When she turned, her eyes weren't the glassy windows of a drugged woman. They were sharp, piercing, and predatory. You look like you've seen a ghost, Beth. She said, her voice a low, melodic purr, or perhaps just an old friend in an SUV. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. She revealed with a chilling smile that she had switched the wine glasses earlier in the evening. She was never drugged. She had simply been playing along, waiting for me to reveal how far I was willing to go. She insisted on making me a calming cup of chamomile tea, her eyes tracking my every movement with a sharpness that made my skin crawl. Sit, she commanded, gesturing to the kitchen island. Drink. You need your strength for what's coming at dawn. The whistle of the kettle sounded like a scream, piercing the heavy silence of the house. I looked at the distorted reflection of Alara's smile in the chrome toaster and realized I had walked straight into a secondary trap. Steam rose. The trap closed. I was no longer the one in control of the narrative. Alara slid the steaming mug across the cold, polished granite island, effectively blocking my path to the exit. She spoke of loyalty and family, her tone maternal, yet laced with the threat of the muscle waiting outside. If I didn't drink, she hinted the men at the gate wouldn't wait for the sun to rise. Fearing a premature confrontation that would get Miller and Kate killed before they could secure the vault, I took a long, agonizing swallow. The floral, deceptive scent of chamomile was a mask for something else. Do you know the taste of your own undoing? It's sweet right up until it burns. The tea had a metallic, almond-like aftertaste that immediately set off alarm bells in my brain. Beth, don't drink, that Kate's voice cut through the air as she rushed into the room from the hallway where she'd been watching. Kate had seen Alara's hands move over the mug, had seen the slight pause that didn't belong. She grabbed for the cup, but I'd already swallowed. Kate caught the mug as it slipped from my fingers, the remaining tea splashing across the floor. Alara let out a soft, mocking laugh. She revealed that the tea wasn't meant to kill me, but to induce a temporary paralysis. They wanted me to be a witness who couldn't speak or move while they finished the excavation of James's final secret. My knees buckled as the floor rushed up to meet me. Kate dropped to her knees beside me, her familiar face blurring. "Beth, stay with me," she cried, her hands supporting my shoulders. Through the haze, I saw Alara pull a secondary burner phone from her apron while Kate frantically dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The kitchen tiles were a freezing mosaic against my cheek, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't make my fingers obey the command to crawl. My limbs felt like they had been replaced by leaden weights, cold and unresponsive. Above me, Kate moved with desperate determination, her 63-year-old body fueled by 30 years of loyalty. She grabbed Alara's arm, trying to stop her from leaving. "What did you give her?" "What was in that tea?" Kate demanded, her voice shaking but fierce. Alara shoved her back, and Kate stumbled against the counter, her hip hitting the granite hard. But she didn't give up. She pulled out her phone, holding it up with trembling hands. "I've already called the police, Alara." "They're on their way," she said, her teacher's voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "Whatever you've done to Beth, they'll know. They'll test her blood. You can't cover this up." Alara's calm facade cracked for just a moment before Detective Miller burst through the back door. Alara's eyes drifted down to me, devoid of any guilt. "The tea was never meant to kill her here, Kate. It is merely a sedative to ensure she reaches the hospital. It is poetic, really. She will pass in the same room where James took his last breath, a suicide born of a broken heart. The clock does not stop for threats. It is already in her blood." I felt my heart skip a jagged beat. It was a rhythmic, hollow fluttering that I recognized from the nights I spent watching James struggle. Suddenly, the back door splintered open. Detective Miller, a man in his late 40s with a weary face etched by years of seeing the worst of humanity, burst into the room with his service weapon drawn. "Beth!" he shouted, dropping to his knees beside me. "Her breathing is too shallow. Kate, get back." He was already on his radio barking for an ambulance and an emergency talk screen. Darkness wasn't a color. It was a weight pressing down on my eyelids. If you're still here with me, comment "still here" so I know you're still on this journey. And tell me if you discovered a secret like this hidden in your own home. Would you confront the person you suspect, or stay quiet and gather proof first? And a quick note, the next part includes some fictionalized details for storytelling. If that's not for you, feel free to stop here. Miller and Kate lifted me my head, lolling back as they rushed me toward the driveway. The black SUV that had been haunting the perimeter moved to block the main gate, its headlights blinding and accusatory, but Miller didn't slow down. He jumped the curb, the car jolting as we bypassed the obstacle. The world became a blur of motion. I was hoisted into the back of an ambulance, the floor vibrating violently. The sirens began their rhythmic, piercing wail, a sound that seemed to vibrate inside my very skull. Kate gripped my hand, her face a mask of terror. "Stay with me, Beth," she pleaded. "Don't you dare close your eyes." Is this how it felt for you, James? This slow, methodical erasure of the self? I could smell the acrid scent of antiseptic and the rubbery tang of latex as the paramedics worked over me, slapping cold, sticky EKG pads onto my chest. My heart rate was bottoming out the monitor, emitting a slow, agonizing beep. We slammed through the ER doors, the flickering strobe of the overhead lights blinding me. As they wheeled my gurney into the trauma bay, a figure stepped into the light. Doctor. Eris Thorne loomed over the gurney, his surgical mask crinkling as he gave a nod that felt more like a sentence than a greeting. He was the same man who had signed James's death certificate, his eyes cold and familiar behind his spectacles. The doctor leaned over my gurney, his mask hiding everything but eyes that didn't look surprised to see me. The smell of industrial bleach and ozone fought for dominance as the ER doors slammed shut behind us, severing the connection to the quiet night outside. I lay trapped in the stillness of my own body, watching the ceiling tiles blur past as they wheeled my gurney toward the trauma bay. Next to my gurney, Kate walked alongside, refusing to leave my side despite the nurses' protests. Her familiar cardigan was stained with tea, her silver hair disheveled, but her hand never left mine. I could taste a bitter, metallic aftertaste in my throat, a ghost of the tea that had paralyzed my voice. Doctor. Eris moved with a clinical predatory grace, his lab coat snapping like a flag in a gale as he barked orders at the trauma team. He was a man in his late 50s, his features sharp and unsympathetic. He didn't wait for the blood results. "Clear the airway, we don't have time for the lab to wake up," he shouted, jumping straight into a gastric lavage protocol. It was highly irregular. Usually they wait for the tox screen to confirm the substance before such invasive measures. He acted with a terrifying certainty, as if he recognized the exact shade of blue my fingernails were turning. He wasn't guessing, he was executing a plan he already knew by heart. "You've seen this before, haven't you?" Kate's voice cut through the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. She stood beside my bed, her reading glasses slipping down her nose as she studied Dr. Aris with a teacher's sharp assessment of a student caught cheating. Dr. Aris didn't look at her, his hands moving with mechanical precision over my chest, but the tension in his shoulders spiked. Flatline. The sound didn't come from the machines, but from the sudden terrifying silence in my own head. For a heartbeat, the blue light of the monitors felt like a burial shroud. I watched him work my mind sharp even as my pulse faltered. He was too fast, too familiar with the specific way the heart slows under this chemical weight. About 30 minutes into the admission, the heavy doors swung open again. Detective Miller entered the bay, bypassing the authorized personnel, only signs with a grim determination. He looked older under the fluorescent lights pulling Kate into a tight huddle, while the nurses were distracted by a sudden drop in my blood pressure. It wasn't an intruder, Kate. It was the pantry, he whispered, his voice jagged. He held a preliminary report from the crime scene techs. The tea set in my kitchen had been laced with a lethal concentration of propranolol, my own prescription. The bottles I had reported lost months ago. I felt a cold wave of betrayal wash over me. High doses of propranolol enough to stop a horse, let alone a 64-year-old woman. How many times had I sat at that table and watched Alara pour the water, never once realizing I was looking at a crime scene in a porcelain pot? Miller leaned in closer to Kate, his eyes darting toward Dr. Aris. "The exhumation of James Garrison has been moved up to tonight," he said. The cemetery soil samples showed chemical leaching identical to the tea toxin. The judge didn't just sign the order, Kate. He's meeting us at the grave. They found something in the ground that shouldn't be there. Terror has a way of turning the familiar lines of a steering wheel into a cage of cold, unyielding plastic. I watched from a fog of residual paralysis as Kate helped me into her old sedan, the same car she'd driven to school for 15 years, with its faded bumper stickers and the rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. Detective Miller had pleaded with her to wait for a patrol escort, his eyes darting toward the sterile hallway where Dr. Aris watched us with a gaze that felt like a surgical incision. Kate's hands shook as she started the engine, but her voice was steady, the same voice that had calmed rowdy classrooms for 30 years. "I'm taking you home, Beth. You'll be safe there." "I promise," she said, though her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. As we reached the parking lot, I noticed the dashboard GPS flickering strangely. It wasn't suggesting the coastal highway. Instead, it pulsed with a forced reroute toward the old Marsh construction road, a dead-end path I knew had been closed for months. "Kate, the GPS is wrong," I tried to say, but my tongue felt like a dry stone in my mouth. She didn't hear me over the rattling of the keys in her trembling hands. The night air was heavy, smelling of salt and impending rain. At the far end of the row, a dark SUV sat motionless, its lights extinguished like a predator, holding its breath. Kate didn't see it until she threw the car into reverse, the tires screaming against the asphalt. We pulled onto the road, the orange glow of a dashboard warning light flickering rhythmically. "Kate, your hands." "They're shaking so hard the keys are rattling," I managed to croak. "Glass is just sand that's forgotten how to be soft." Tonight, it felt like diamonds. The jarring vibration of the steering wheel seemed to travel through the chassis and settle in my marrow. We were halfway down the bridge road when the twin suns appeared in the rearview mirror. The dark SUV had surfaced from the shadows, maintaining a precise, haunting distance. For a few minutes, Kate tried to rationalize it, her cold sweat stinging her eyes as she gripped the wheel. But then the vehicle accelerated. It didn't just speed up, it lunged. "Wake up, Beth! I need you to stay awake!" Kate screamed, her foot slamming the accelerator. The shrill beep of the seatbelt alarm began to wail, a frantic heartbeat for the car itself. "He's not passing." Kate sobbed, her knuckles white against the plastic. "He's not passing, he's aiming." The headlights behind us were twin suns burning through the rearview mirror until my world was nothing but blinding, white-hot malice. I smelled the acrid scent of hot rubber as Kate tried to swerve the car fishtailing over the slick pavement. Just as the vehicle drew parallel to our bumper, a flash of white caught my eye. A rental sticker on the SUV's rear window, the exact same agency Everett had mentioned using for his business trip. The realization hit me a split second before the steel did. The impact was a symphony of grinding metal and shattering safety glass. The world spun into a chaotic kaleidoscope of black water and silver moonlight. Then there was only the hiss of a punctured radiator and the heavy silence of the marsh. The driver's side door of the SUV creaked open, and a pair of polished Oxfords stepped onto the asphalt, crunching the glass of my shattered life. The world tasted like copper and burnt rubber, a jagged symphony of hissing steam, and my own ragged breath. My head lolled against the cold steering wheel as I watched through a spider web of shattered glass. Those Oxfords stopped inches from my face. Everett didn't reach down to check my pulse or offer a frantic apology. Instead, he reached into the twisted debris near my window, his movements clinical and unhurried. He wasn't trying to finish me off. He was searching for something specific. I watched with leaden eyes as he retrieved the burner phone I had shoved into the door pocket earlier, a piece of evidence I hadn't even realized was so vital. He leaned in his shadow, swallowing the light. "You really should have stayed in the city, Kate," he said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that cut through the smell of ozone. This wasn't supposed to be personal. There was no remorse in his eyes, only the flat calculation of a man fixing a clerical error. He tucked the phone into his coat and retreated, the crunch of his footsteps fading as he returned to the damaged SUV. I tried to scream, but the effort only brought more copper to my tongue. The engine roared and the Predator reversed into the dark, leaving us to the silence of the marsh. Silence is the loudest sound when you're dying. I felt myself drifting the stars above the windshield, beginning to spin like silver coins in a well. Hours later, the scene shifted in the fractured mirror of my mind to a sterile airport rental return lot. A shadowy figure moved under the flickering fluorescent hum of the security office. He didn't look back as he dropped the keys into the overnight box. A secondary vehicle waited at the edge of the perimeter, its engine idling. "Is it handled?" a voice asked from the driver's side. Everett climbed in his face, obscured by the brim of a hat. "The car is their problem now," he replied, and the vehicle merged into the 3 a.m. traffic. By morning, the investigation moved to a different kind of clinical space. Detective Miller stood with a posture that suggested he had spent 20 years carrying the weight of other people's secrets. He was a tall man with deep-set eyes that seemed to record everything. He watched the high-definition perimeter security footage with a forensic technician, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Zoom in on the left wrist." "That's a unique watch face," Miller ordered, tapping the screen. The figure on the monitor had been careful, avoiding the main overhead lights, but a momentary glitch in his stride forced him to check the time. The profile was sharp, the expensive watch reflecting the blue light of the lot. "Run it through the facial recognition sweep." "We have a match," the tech said, the computer chirping as Everett's name appeared in the results. "How does a man so careful become so visible?" Miller paced the small office, his thumb tracing his jawline. It didn't sit right with him. The trail was too clean, the evidence almost presented on a silver platter. He watched the footage again, seeing how Everett turned his face just enough for the sensor to catch. Detective Miller didn't see a criminal getting sloppy. He saw a man handing them a map to a treasure that didn't exist. The security footage Miller had shown me was a haunting loop of calculated deception. But as I stood in the biting dawn of Oakwood Cemetery, the grainy pixels felt far away compared to the cold reality of the shovel. The ground was more stubborn than I expected, clinging to the mahogany casket, as if the earth itself wanted to keep James's secrets buried. I pulled my wool coat tighter against the damp Missouri air, the smell of wet earth filling my lungs like a physical weight. Beside me, Detective Miller remained a statue of professional detachment, his eyes tracking the mud-slicked chains of the backhoe. The whine of the winch was a high-pitched scream in the silence of the graveyard. As the casket finally broke the surface, a jagged gasp escaped me. We both saw it immediately. The heavy lid bore deep, fresh score marks near the seal metal gouged by a tool that didn't belong to the cemetery staff. Someone had been here before us, tampering with the dead in a desperate bid to check their work. Dirt doesn't just hide bodies, it preserves the evidence of our failures. Miller's hand found my shoulder, a brief anchor of heat in the morning chill. "Do you think he'll forgive me for this?" I whispered, my voice cracking like dry parchment. "Justice isn't about forgiveness, Beth," he replied, his gaze never leaving the disturbed casket. "It's about the truth." The transition from the sacred ground to the clinical sterility of the county medical examiner's office was a blur of gray highways and stale precinct coffee. 6 hours later, the smell of formaldehyde replaced the scent of rain. Doctor. Eris moved with the terrifying precision of a man who spent more time with the dead than the living his lab coat, a stark bleached white against the steel tables. Doctor. Eris, a spindly man in his 60s who wore his glasses on a silver chain, gestured toward a digital readout with a latex-gloved hand. I forced myself to look at the remains of the man I had loved for 30 years. It wasn't a heart attack, the doctor said, his voice as thin and sharp as a scalpel. His heart was forced to stop. The toxicology report showed concentrations of digitalis that defied any medical logic. This was long-term, deliberate administration, Beth. The reality that James was slowly murdered under my own roof while I slept in the next room felt like a physical blow to my chest. The fluorescent lights of the lab felt like interrogation lamps, stripping away the comfort of my denial. By late afternoon, we were back at the precinct. The atmosphere was electric, a buzzing tension that hummed through the scuffed linoleum floors. Miller laid the warrants out on his scarred wooden desk, the paper looking deceptively ordinary for something so heavy with consequence. I watched the scratch of his fountain pen as he signed his name, the sound echoing the finality of a gavel. "It's done," he said, looking up at me with a grim sort of satisfaction. "No more running. We move tonight." My heart hammered a vengeful rhythm against my ribs as I reached for the documents. But as Miller handed me a second, smaller folder, his expression shifted from triumph to something more guarded. He revealed that a second secret warrant had been issued for a surprise accomplice whose name hadn't surfaced in any of our previous briefings. Miller handed me the second folder, and the name on the tab made the room spin faster than the SUV that had run me off the road. I stared at the name on that folder until the letters blurred into a jagged, unrecognizable mess. Ilara. The name didn't just burn my eyes. It incinerated every memory I had of home, leaving nothing but the ash of a lifelong lie. She was the one who held my hand at the funeral. She was the one who brought me soup and whispered that everything would be all right. I stood in the precinct hallway, the cold, fluorescent lights suddenly feeling like teeth. I had let the second murderer into my inner sanctum, served her tea, and told her my deepest fears. How could I have been so blind? It was never just Everett acting alone. It was a coordinated effort by the people I trusted most. I drove home in a daze, the rhythm of the breaking storm echoing the fracturing of my reality. When I stepped inside, the oppressive quiet of the hallway felt like a physical blow. Every floorboard creak sounded like an accusation. I looked at the family photos on the mantel, now seeing Ilara hiding in plain sight. Within the frames, her smile transformed into a predator's grin. I realized the digitalis wasn't just administered in the kitchen, but perhaps right here in this living room under the guise of sisterly care. I was a fool who had invited the wolf to share my hearth. The air in the house grew heavy with the smell of ozone as thunder rumbled in the distance. Is it still paranoia if the people you love are actually holding the knife? I moved to the home office, my hands shaking as I checked the security system monitor. The grainy black and white feed flickered, showing the gravel drive far below. A vehicle was pulled over near the tree line, its lights extinguished. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over Detective Miller's contact. I pressed call, but the signal bars vanished instantly, leaving me with a haunting silence. The movement of flashlights cut through the trees, two distinct beams moving with predatory intent toward the house. "Pick up the phone, Miller," I pleaded to the empty air. "Please." But they were already here. The storm broke, then rain lashing against the windows in a frenzied assault. I retreated toward the kitchen, my hand finding the cold weight of a kitchen knife on the counter. Suddenly, the hum of the refrigerator stopped. One by one, the smart home lights winked out in a terrifying sequence. It wasn't a power failure, it was a termination. I heard the faint metallic click of wire cutters and the distinct snip of the external lines being severed. The darkness didn't just fall, it arrived. The house was no longer a fortress. It was a trap designed by people who knew every lock and every exit. Kate, a voice called out from the porch, sickeningly familiar. It was Everett, but Alara's shadow was right beside him. "We know you're in there. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I could hear the rhythmic thud of a shoulder hitting the back door. They weren't just here to kill me. I saw the glint of a medical bag in the next flash of lightning. They had brought a specialized chemical agent to stage my death as a suicide mirroring the overdose profile they used on James. The back door gave way with a sickening crack of splintering oak, and for a heartbeat, the only thing visible was the glint of Alara's eyes in the sudden flash of lightning. The sound of glass shattering in the mudroom echoed through the dark house like a gunshot. I didn't run for the front door. I ran for the one room that still held the ghost of James's protection. My lungs burned as I scrambled into his mahogany-lined study, slamming the heavy door shut. I threw my shoulder against the massive mahogany desk, groaning under the weight as I shoved it across the floorboards. It moved with a screech of protest, finally wedging against the frame. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped my phone, but the screen glowed with a hidden purpose. I never actually lost signal. I had activated a silent panic app provided by Miller earlier that afternoon, and I could see the tiny pulse of the active recording. The police were listening to every breath I took. Outside the door, the heavy rhythmic footsteps of Everett slowed. Alara's voice came next, soft and chillingly mocking. "It's over, Beth. Just open the door and we can make this painless," she said, her tone as casual as if she were offering me a second cup of tea. I bit my lip until I tasted the metallic tang of iron. "You killed him in this very house, didn't you?" I shouted, my voice thick with a mix of terror and a new, sharp resolve. I needed them to speak. I needed the recording to be undeniable. There was a pause, then the sudden violent bite of steel against wood. Everett had found the fire axe in the hallway. The axe blade biting into the wood sounded like a giant's teeth, gnashing through my last hope. I pressed my back against the far wall, staring at the growing splinters. "Why, Alara? You were like family," I cried out, baiting the hook. The wood groaned again. "James was a dinosaur, Beth." She snapped back, her patience finally fraying. He was holding us all back from the expansion we deserved. The digitalis was just efficient, a natural-looking end for a man with a weak heart. You were supposed to be the grieving widow who followed him shortly after. It was clean until you started digging. I watched the door panel buckle. The smell of splintered wood filled the small space, thick and suffocating. Another strike, and Everett's hand reached through the jagged hole for the handle. But then, the world outside the study windows exploded. Light is the ultimate predator for those who live in the dark. Blinding blue and red strobes flooded the room, cutting through the shadows. Miller's team breached the house with a roar of boots and commands. "Get on the ground." Now the heavy desk was shoved aside from the outside by officers in tactical gear. I slumped to the floor, watching as the shadows of my killers were pinned against the hallway wall. A syringe and a pre-written suicide note tumbled from Alara's bag, kicked across the carpet by a heavy boot. "We have the confession on the open line," Everett Miller's voice boomed. "It's done." As the cold click of handcuffs echoed, Everett turned to Alara, his face twisted in a mask of genuine shock. He realized then that she was the one who had tipped off the police about the rental car footage, ensuring he took the fall for the crash while she planned to walk free. As the handcuffs clicked shut on Alara's wrists, she leaned in toward me, her eyes like chips of ice. She whispered the location of the one piece of evidence that could still destroy me. "Justice has a specific scent floor, wax-old paper, and the stale sweat of people whose lives have finally run out of room to breathe." Standing in the cold, sterile halls of the Superior Court, 8 weeks after that horrific night at my home in the first week of December 2025, The air felt thin. I spent the morning of the trial mentally staring at the ghost Ilara had conjured. The insurance policy James left behind, a hidden ledger I found in his old safe deposit box, didn't prove her innocence. Instead, it proved I was technically an unwitting beneficiary of the fraud Everett used to justify the murder. I had tried to bury it, believing it would only tarnish a dead man's name, but the dry taste of fear in my mouth told me Ilara knew. Detective Miller met me near the heavy oak doors, offering a silent nod of support that felt heavier than a lecture. "Whatever she said to you that night, Beth, don't let it be the thing that wins her this case," he said, his voice low. I looked at the gray in his hair, realizing how much this had aged us both. "It's not about winning anymore, Miller," I replied with a grim determination. "It's about ending it." I adjusted my suit jacket, my fingers brushing against the pocket where I kept a small photograph of James. The trial wasn't just about the digitalis anymore. It was about whether I could survive the exposure of the foundation our entire life was built upon. How can a mother's heart be a courtroom and an executioner's block all at once? I didn't have an answer, as the bailiff signaled for us to enter. The blinding camera flashes in the hallway momentarily turned the world white, a sensory assault that made my head throb. Then the courtroom doors swung open. I walked the gauntlet of press and curious onlookers, the muffled hum of the air conditioning, the only sound against the clicking of my heels. I saw Ilara sitting at the defense table looking polished and devastatingly innocent in a soft cream suit. She caught my eye and offered a smile so faint it could be mistaken for a twitch, but I saw the predator underneath. Everett was absent, having already taken a plea deal to testify against her. Prosecutor Vance had the sharp, hungry look of a hawk, his movements efficient and his voice designed to fill every corner of the room with authority. "The state calls Beth Garrison to the stand," Vance announced, his voice cutting through the tension. I moved toward the front of the room, the cold grain of the witness stand wood beneath my palms as I climbed the steps. My daughter's gaze was a physical weight against my skin, a silent plea or a threat I couldn't tell. One hand on the truth, the other on a lie. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the clerk asked. "I do." I whispered, my voice sounding foreign in the high-ceilinged room. "Mrs. Garrison, tell the jury about the night your husband died," Vance began. I opened my mouth to speak, but my eyes darted toward the defense table. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that Ilara's legal team was shuffling a set of documents I recognized all too well. They had subpoenaed the very ledger I thought I had successfully hidden from the police. The defense attorney didn't look at me with aggression. He looked at me with the predatory glee of a man holding the match that would burn my entire life to the ground. I gripped the edge of the witness stand until my knuckles turned the color of the marble pillars surrounding us, refusing to let the defense attorney's voice shake the truth loose. He brandished the ledger like a weapon, his voice booming as he accused me of being the puppet master who manipulated Ilara and Everett into a corporate coup. The courtroom held its breath, a sea of judgmental eyes fixed on me. I took a slow, steadying breath, my fingers brushing the cold grain of the stand. "Look at the last page, counselor. Look at the date," I said, my voice cutting through his theatrics with sharp clarity. As he flipped to the end, the air in the room seemed to vanish. James hadn't been hiding those records from me. He had been writing them to me as a final confession and apology. He documented his own guilt and his detailed plan to turn himself in to the authorities, to protect my future. The incriminating evidence became the ultimate proof of Ilara's motive. He was going to confess, I told the jury, staring directly at my daughter. That is why she couldn't let him live. She needed the inheritance, and she couldn't let him bankrupt the firm with a scandal. James's heart was already failing, but Ilara simply accelerated the inevitable to ensure the money stayed safe. The defense attorney's predatory glee withered into a frantic stutter as the courtroom erupted in a low, thunderous murmur of realization. A verdict isn't a bandage. It's just the moment the bleeding finally stops. When the day of judgment finally arrived a week later in mid-December 2025, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy final silence. I leaned against the cold steel of the courthouse railing, my heart hammering a slow, somber rhythm. The judge's voice was surgical in its coldness as the words were read. Guilty on count 1. Guilty on count 2. Alara was found guilty on all counts, including the attempted murder of her own mother. As the bailiffs moved in, she was led away in chains. Our eyes met one last time, and I searched for a flicker of regret, a shadow of the girl I had raised. There was nothing but a hollow, echoing silence in her gaze. "It's finally over, Beth. Go home," Detective Miller whispered, placing a steady hand on my shoulder as I stood on the courthouse steps. I walked away, leaving the swarm of reporters and flashing bulbs behind the warm afternoon sun on dust motes feeling like a baptism. I arrived home to find the front door open, the scent of fresh cedar drifting through the hallway. Thane was kneeling in the study, fit-testing the last of the new floorboards where the axe had splintered the oak. Thane was a man made of rough edges and sawdust, his presence as sturdy and uncomplicated as the timber he worked with. The house breathed again. The rhythmic strike of his hammer was a healing cadence that drowned out the memory of the gavel. "The wood is set. It'll hold now," he said, looking up with an expression of genuine peace. "Thank you, Thane." For everything, I replied, watching the sunlight stream through the windows. As he began packing his tools, Thane revealed that Detective Miller had hired him for more than just carpentry. The December sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the study windows. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of carolers in the distance, a reminder that Christmas was only 2 weeks away. It had been exactly 2 years since James last decorated the tree in this very room. He had been discreetly sweeping the house for any secondary surprises Alara might have left behind. He reached into his tool bag and pulled out a small velvet-lined box he'd found tucked behind the baseboard, something James had hidden for a day that never came. I've had a long time to think about everything that happened in my home. If I could go back, I would ask more questions and trust my instincts sooner. My biggest mistake was believing that love alone could protect a family. Too often, the most painful family drama stories begin when we ignore the warning signs simply because they come from the people closest to us. Now, my life has become one of those grandma stories people listen to with disbelief, but the lesson is simple. Never give up your judgment just to keep the peace. Many family drama stories are not born from hatred, they grow quietly from silence, denial, and misplaced trust. And many grandma stories like mine are told by someone who survived long enough to understand the truth. I believe God allowed the truth to surface when I was finally strong enough to face it. Faith didn't remove the pain, but it gave me the courage to stand up when everything around me collapsed. If people remember this as one of those difficult family drama stories, I hope they also remember the lesson hidden inside it. And if someday it becomes one of those grandma stories passed from listener to listener, let it remind you to protect your dignity and your peace. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were Beth facing betrayal from your own family? I truly want to hear your perspective. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories of resilience and truth. A quick note. While inspired by real experiences, some elements were dramatized for storytelling. If this type of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos on the channel.